Look at the two of you. Everywhere I go, I find you together. Crystal stood with her arms folded in the middle of the small Millbrook street, watching her younger sister Ruby hand a lunchbox to the mechanic outside his rundown garage. Ruby sighed. What is it now? What is it? I should be the one asking. Why are you always hanging around this poor mechanic? Look at him, grease all over his shirt, calloused hands, a garage that's about to fall apart. Is this really the man you choose to waste your time with? Cole greeted her politely, but Crystal waved him off. Save your greetings. I'm trying to understand what my sister sees in you. I see a good person, Ruby said. Crystal burst out laughing. A good person? Can a good person buy a penthouse? Can a good person turn someone into a queen? Not everything is about money. That's exactly what poor people always say. While you're busy admiring mechanics, I'm waiting for a real man, wealthy, powerful, luxury cars, a mansion. You two can spend the rest of your lives counting delivery orders together. Ruby looked at her sister, her voice still calm. I would rather be with a good person than a rich man with a rotten heart. Then keep your good-hearted mechanic. But when my man finally shows up, don't come begging to visit my mansion. Crystal lifted her chin and walked away. Cole quietly watched her disappear down the street, a faint, unreadable smile crossing his grease-stained face, and he said softly, One day, she will learn appearances are the easiest thing to be fooled by. What no one in that neighborhood knew was that the poor mechanic they saw every single day was hiding a secret powerful enough to shake an entire city. If you love meaningful stories like this one, please hit the like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next story. Now, let's begin. At 4:30 in the morning, while the entire Millbrook neighborhood still lay buried in darkness, the small light inside the Lawson family's old house came on. Ruby sat up, folded her blanket neatly, then slipped quietly downstairs to the kitchen so she wouldn't wake her father. The first thing she did every day, even before washing her face, was arrange Earl's medicine in a plastic tray divided into little compartments. The morning painkiller, the midday anti-inflammatory medicine, the mild sleeping pill for nights when the weather changed and his old injury began to ache. She did it so skillfully that she could have placed every pill correctly in complete darkness, because she'd been doing it for 6 years. Ever since the day her father fell from a work platform at the steel mill and came home with one leg that would never be whole again. On the kitchen table stood a faded wooden frame, holding a photograph of her mother. The woman in the picture wore a gentle smile and a thin scarf over a head left completely bare by rounds of chemotherapy. Beside the photograph lay a thick stack of papers whose every number Ruby knew by heart without needing to open them. Her mother's hospital bills, the only thing she had left behind besides her love. 7 years had passed, and Ruby was still paying them, a little each month, like someone trying to empty a pond with a tiny dipper. Ruby touched the frame softly and whispered, as she did every morning, I'm leaving for work now, Mom, then pulled on the raincoat worn thin at the shoulders and wheeled her delivery scooter out from beneath the porch. It had been raining since early that morning. The streets of Millbrook were soaked through, and the pale yellow glow of the streetlights cast her shadow across the pavement as the small young woman wove between rows of houses with a cargo box packed full behind her. Ruby began her first run at 5 o'clock, delivering bread to the diner at the top of the street, and from there she was swept into one order after another, without pause. People saw only a brief glimpse of her as she passed, her reflective jacket wet with rain, her smile always appearing before anything else, her greeting always arriving before her knock on the door. Near noon, she stopped outside Mrs. Whitfield's little house at the end of 9th Street. The order was only a bag of apples and a box of tea. But Ruby knew the old woman lived alone, and that her children and grandchildren were far away, so she always accepted her deliveries without charging a fee. She even carried the bag all the way into the kitchen and checked the flickering light bulb above the porch for her. Mrs. Whitfield pressed a few coins into Ruby's hand, but Ruby smiled, pushed them back, and told her to save the money for more tea, then hurried away before the old woman could say another word. That afternoon, when Ruby stopped to buy a sandwich for her own late lunch, she saw the familiar homeless man huddled beneath the awning of the old supermarket. Ruby broke the sandwich in half, handed one piece to him, and sat beside him on the steps for a few minutes while they ate like two old friends before she headed back into the rain. She didn't think of it as kindness. She simply believed that everyone needed lunch. The Lawson household survived on 3 patched-together sources of income: There was Earl's meager disability payment, the little money he earned repairing fans, electric kettles, and old radios for neighbors while seated at the wooden table on the front porch, and the sweat-soaked dollars Ruby brought home from her delivery runs. Then there was Crystal, Ruby's older sister, who worked as a receptionist at a hotel on the main avenue and received her full paycheck every month, yet had never once placed a single dollar into the family's shared tin box. Her money was an investment in her own future, Crystal declared, and that future consisted of new dresses, expensive lipstick, and the dream of a man who would carry her away from this neighborhood. That evening, Ruby arrived home close to 10 o'clock, drenched, her hands cold, yet she still warmed up her father's soup before he took his medicine. Crystal was stretched across the sofa, scrolling through her phone and staring at photographs of strangers' mansions and yachts online. When she saw her younger sister walk in, she frowned and pulled the blanket higher. "Could you please change your clothes before coming into the living room? You've brought the smell of rain and grease all the way in here." Ruby only gave her a tired smile and said nothing. The next morning, Ruby had already completed 3 deliveries by the time Crystal finally dragged herself awake to the sound of her father calling for her to get up before she was late for work. Hugging her pillow, she groaned, "Oh my God, why does the sun have to come up every day? It already came up yesterday. Why does it have to come up again today?" Earl, sitting on the porch, heard her and laughed as he shook his head. "Sweetheart, if the sun didn't rise, who would go to work and keep this family alive?" Crystal called back while brushing her hair. "Then let Ruby do it. She was born to run around in the streets. I was born to live somewhere other than this slum." Earl fell silent for a long moment. Then he spoke in the slow voice of a man who had already lived through more than half his life. "Listen to me, daughter. This family may be poor in money, but it has never been poor in character. And character is what follows a person to the end of life. Money doesn't." Crystal slipped on her shoes, reached for her handbag, and tossed one final remark over her shoulder before walking out the door. "Character doesn't pay the bills, Dad. Just wait and see. My man is going to appear soon, and when he does, this whole neighborhood will look at me differently." The door closed behind her. Earl remained beside his repair table in silence, watching the shadow of his eldest daughter disappear, then turned his gaze toward the far end of the street, where the steady sound of a power drill from the new mechanic's garage echoed through the gray, rain-soaked morning. He didn't yet know that before long, both of those things, the man in Crystal's dreams and the grease-stained mechanic at the end of the street, would enter his family's life at the very same time and change everything in a way none of them could ever have imagined. 3 months before that rainy morning, the Millbrook neighborhood welcomed a stranger. He appeared on an ordinary afternoon, with no luxury car, no piles of luggage, only a faded canvas bag slung over one shoulder, and the unhurried stride of a man who had nowhere he needed to reach in haste. The stranger stopped in front of the abandoned auto repair shop at the end of the street, a place that had stood silent and closed for years since its former owner died. He remained there for a long time, studying it, then went straight to the neighborhood manager's house and asked to rent it. He said his name was Cole, paid 6 months of rent in cash, and offered nothing more. Within a week, the shop everyone had assumed was dead came back to life. The rusted metal door was repainted, the concrete floor was scrubbed clean, and a plain wooden sign was hung above the entrance bearing only 3 words: Cole Auto Repair. The people in the neighborhood were deeply curious, because Millbrook was the kind of place where someone could cough at one end of the street and people at the other end would already know about it, yet no one could uncover anything about this new mechanic. Mrs. Pearl, the owner of the laundromat and the woman known as the neighborhood's own radio station, personally carried over a plate of cookies to introduce herself. She sat asking him questions for nearly an hour, but when she returned, she could sum up everything she had learned in a single sentence. "That young man is gentle and polite, but he's as sealed shut as a locked mailbox." People asked where he came from, and he said it was very far away. They asked about his family, and he said he was alone now. They asked why he had chosen Millbrook, and he only smiled and said the place was quiet. 3 answers, no more and no less, and everyone who asked received exactly the same ones. But there was one thing no one needed to ask about, because they could see it for themselves, and that was his skill. His ability was so unusual that it soon became a story told throughout the neighborhood. Mr. Hooper's vegetable truck broke down in the middle of the street, and 2 mechanics from the next town came to inspect it. They took half the engine apart and spent the entire morning searching without finding the problem. Yet Cole stood beside the truck and listened to the engine for less than a minute before pointing out the exact part buried deep inside that had failed. He finished the repair before lunch. Mr. Hooper went around telling everyone that the young man didn't repair vehicles with his hands. He repaired them with his ears, because whatever a machine had to say, Cole could hear it. After that, every broken vehicle in the neighborhood found its way to the shop at the end of the street, and people began noticing something else as well. Cole's prices were almost absurdly low. When a struggling family came to him, he charged only for the parts, and sometimes he didn't take a single dollar. Someone warned him that if he kept doing business that way, he would end up living on porridge. Cole only replied, "I don't eat much." Then came one particular morning, the morning the entire neighborhood would remember for years. Cole was walking past Mrs. Pearl's laundromat when he saw the Lawson sisters standing outside. Ruby was holding a bag of laundry for a regular customer, while Crystal was studying her reflection in the shop window and adjusting her hair. Cole stopped, nodded politely, and said, "Good morning. I'm Cole, the new mechanic at the shop down the street. If either of you ever has a vehicle that needs fixing, just bring it by." Ruby smiled and answered immediately, "Hello. Welcome to the neighborhood." Crystal turned around, and the look in her eyes at that moment, as Mrs. Pearl would later describe it, was exactly like the look of someone who had just discovered a cockroach in the middle of her dinner plate. She looked him over from head to toe, from the streak of grease still caught in his hair, to his faded work shirt and calloused hands, all the way down to the old shoes worn thin at the soles, then curled her lips. "A mechanic," she said, loudly enough for every customer inside the laundromat to hear. "Why are you introducing yourself to me? So I can bring my electric scooter over and have you patch the inner tube." Cole kept his expression calm. "I was only trying to get acquainted with my neighbors." Crystal laughed. "Get acquainted? Do you think we're on the same level? That you and I should get acquainted? Listen, I don't make a habit of knowing people whose hands are covered in grease." Ruby tugged at her sister's arm and pleaded softly, "Crystal." He only said hello, but Crystal had already gathered momentum. She lifted her chin toward Cole and spoke each word clearly, as though reading an official announcement. "Come back when you own a supercar if you want to speak to me. Until then, stay away from me." The entire laundromat fell silent. Mrs. Pearl stood behind the counter with her mouth open, forgetting the clothes she had been folding. The customers looked at one another, and no one dared make a sound. Ruby's face burned red with shame for her sister. Cole, however, didn't blush, didn't frown, and didn't answer with a single angry word. He only looked at Crystal for several seconds with an unreadable stillness in his eyes, then gave a slight nod and wished her a pleasant day. With that, he turned and walked away, his steps just as steady as when he had arrived, leaving an entire laundromat frozen behind him. Before lunchtime, the story had traveled through all of Millbrook, from the laundromat to the vegetable stand, and across the front steps where the older women sat shelling beans. People repeated the remark about the supercar again and again, shaking their heads in every imaginable way. Some clicked their tongues and said the girl might be beautiful, but her nature was as sharp as vinegar. Others sighed and said they felt sorry for the mechanic, because he was such a gentle soul, humiliated in front of a crowd and still polite enough to wish the person who insulted him a good day. That evening, the story reached Earl. He sat in silence beside his repair table for a long time, then called Crystal out and asked, "Is it true that you spoke to that man that way today?" Crystal shrugged. "I only told the truth. When I don't like someone, I say it directly. That's better than being fake." Earl looked at his eldest daughter with sorrow weighing heavily in his eyes. "Do you know something? I worked for other people my entire life. My hands were once covered in grease just like his. So in your opinion, does that mean I'm the kind of man who isn't even worthy of being greeted?" Crystal looked unsettled for a moment, then lifted her chin. "You're different. You're my father." Earl slowly shook his head. "No, sweetheart, I'm not different. When you despise a person because of the clothes they wear, sooner or later, someone else's clothes will blind you." Crystal stamped her foot and stormed into her room, throwing one last sentence over her shoulder. "Just wait and see. The man meant for me will never be the kind who wears clothes stained with grease." Earl remained alone beneath the yellow light and let out a long sigh. He didn't know that at the far end of the street, inside that weathered old garage, the mechanic his daughter had humiliated that morning was sitting quietly at a wooden table. And if someone had happened to look through the narrow opening in the door at that moment, they would have seen something strange. The poor man didn't appear saddened at all. He was simply smiling faintly to himself in the darkness, the smile of a man who had just found exactly what he had traveled a very long way to find. All through the next day, Ruby felt a heaviness inside her that followed her everywhere. She made her deliveries, but her mind kept returning to the scene outside the laundromat, to the calm face of the mechanic, while her sister humiliated him in front of so many people, and to the wish for a pleasant day he had left behind before walking away. They had treated him so badly, yet he had still managed to remain kind, and that troubled her more than anything else. Late that afternoon, after completing her final delivery, Ruby went home and took the extra portion of food that she and her mother always prepared each day, placed it carefully in a container, closed the lid, then walked toward the end of the street. The garage door was still open, and yellow light spilled out from inside. Cole was bent over an old lawnmower someone had brought in for repair. Ruby stopped at the entrance, drew a breath, and tapped softly against the metal door. Cole looked up, saw her, wiped his hands on a rag, and stood. "Hello. Is something wrong with your scooter?" Ruby shook her head and held the food container out in front of her. "I brought this for you, and I came to apologize." Cole looked at the container, then at her. "Apologize for what?" "For yesterday," Ruby said, her voice growing quieter. "For what my sister said to you outside the laundromat. Those words were cruel. I'm ashamed of the way she treated you, and I want you to know that not everyone in this neighborhood thinks the way she does." Cole remained silent for a moment, then did something that surprised Ruby. He pulled out the only wooden chair in the garage and invited her to sit, while he lowered himself onto his toolbox and opened the food container as naturally as though the two of them had known each other for years. "Did you cook this?" he asked. "My mother used to cook wonderfully. I only managed to learn a little from her," Ruby replied. Cole took a bite and nodded thoughtfully. "Then you learned more than a little." Ruby laughed, then suddenly remembered why she had come and grew serious again. "You still haven't answered me. Are you angry with my sister?" Cole paused with his chopsticks in hand and thought for a second, as though the question itself were strange, then shook his head. "No." Ruby stared at him. "Not even a little? She said such hurtful things in front of all those people." Cole shrugged. "You work in deliveries, so you understand how tiring it is to carry a heavy box all day. Anger is heavy. I already carry things all day. I don't need to carry that too." Ruby sat in silence for several seconds. She had prepared so many comforting words in her mind for a man she expected to find wounded, yet the man sitting before her didn't need a single one of them. He said it so lightly, not as though he were forcing himself to appear noble, but as though letting go of anger were as natural to him as putting down something that didn't belong to him. From that day on, Ruby began stopping by the garage more often. At first, she brought meals because she reasoned that a man who accepted an apology also had to accept the food that came with it. Before long, it became a habit. Whenever she finished her deliveries early, she would stop by, sometimes with a container of food, sometimes with boiled corn, sit for a while, exchange a few words, then go home. Cole didn't speak much, but strangely, sitting beside him never felt awkward. He knew how to listen, and every now and then, he would make some dry remark that left her laughing so hard she nearly choked. One afternoon, Ruby's aging delivery scooter coughed several times, then died directly in front of the garage, as though it had somehow known where to find a doctor. Ruby's face fell. That scooter was the fishing rod that fed her entire family, and if it needed a major repair, she had no idea where the money would come from. Cole came out and wheeled it inside. After listening to the rattling noise it had made, he said immediately, "The gearbox is worn, the drive belt is cracked, and the spark plug needs replacing too. Keep riding it for another month and it'll leave you stranded in the rain." Ruby asked anxiously how much it would cost. Cole didn't answer. He only told her to leave the scooter there and come back for it the next day. When she returned, her old scooter started with a smooth hum, as though it had never aged at all, and he hadn't only repaired the engine. He had stitched the torn seat and tightened the loose delivery basket as well. Ruby searched one pocket after another. "Tell me how much it is. I can pay you little by little." Cole shook his head. "The parts were old ones I restored. They weren't worth much." Ruby refused. "No, you worked on it for half the day. I can't let you do all that for nothing." Cole thought for a moment, then said, "All right, then pay me with another meal." Ruby stood there, half wanting to argue and half wanting to laugh. But in the end, she had no choice except to surrender to the stubborn mechanic. That evening, the two of them sat outside the garage eating boiled corn, and in the easy flow of conversation, Ruby asked. "Cole, where are you from? Your accent doesn't sound like it belongs around here." It was only a casual question, yet she saw the hand peeling the corn pause for half a second. "Very far away," he answered. "How far? Near the ocean or near the mountains?" Cole looked out at the dark street, and for one very brief moment, Ruby saw his eyes darken, as though some door inside him had suddenly closed. "Near the city," he said, then stood and brushed off his hands. "It's late. You should go home before your father starts worrying." Ruby left with a small question resting in her heart, but she told herself that everyone had things they didn't want to talk about. What she didn't know was that later, that very night, sometime after 11 o'clock, when every light in Millbrook had gone dark, a gleaming black car with tinted windows, the kind of car no one in that neighborhood had ever ridden in even once, glided silently down the street and stopped directly in front of the repair shop. A shadowy figure stepped out, disappeared inside for about half an hour, then left again, and the car vanished into the night as quietly as though it had never been there. The entire neighborhood slept through it, except for one person. Mrs. Pearl had gotten out of bed that night to search for a bottle of medicated oil and happened to glance through the narrow opening in her curtains. She saw everything. The next morning, the Millbrook radio station immediately went on the air. Mrs. Pearl told the vegetable seller told the butcher, and by noon, the whole neighborhood knew about the mysterious black car. Some people said it must have been an old customer from far away bringing in a vehicle for repair. Others wondered whether it had been a creditor. Someone even guessed that Cole had won the grand prize in the lottery and was hiding it. Mrs. Pearl planted both hands on the counter and delivered her conclusion with absolute certainty. "I'm telling you, there's more to that mechanic than meets the eye. Every locked mailbox has to open someday. I'm only afraid that when his finally does, no one in this whole neighborhood will be strong enough to handle what's inside." The story of the black car gradually faded like every other rumor in Millbrook, because although the neighborhood loved gossip, it also forgot quickly, and because everyone was busy preparing for a much bigger event, the annual neighborhood barbecue. Once a year, when autumn arrived, the residents of Millbrook carried tables and chairs into the empty lot beside Mrs. Pearl's laundromat. One family brought meat, another brought bread, another brought corn, and the charcoal fires glowed red from afternoon until night. It was the one occasion each year when even those who spent the rest of the year doing no more than greeting one another over their fences sat down to share the same meal. This year, for the first time, the new mechanic was there. Cole arrived carrying a case of soft drinks and intending to sit quietly in a corner, but Millbrook never allowed anyone to sit quietly. Mr. Hooper dragged him over to the grill to show off his skill at turning ribs. Mrs. Pearl insisted that he judge her apple pie, and when someone turned on the music and the crowd began swaying in the middle of the lot, the true disaster of his evening finally descended upon him. Several middle-aged women seized the mechanic and pulled him into the center of the circle. Cole waved both hands frantically and protested, "I don't know how to dance," but in Millbrook, those words only made people more determined. Then the entire neighborhood witnessed a spectacle that would still bring tears of laughter to their eyes many years later. The mechanic who could repair every machine in the world turned out to be incapable of controlling his own two legs. He danced like a puppet with loose screws, his arms and legs each moving in a different direction, and even stepped on Mrs. Pearl's foot so hard that she shrieked. The children sitting on the steps clapped thunderously and rolled about laughing, and one of them shouted, "Dance again, Uncle Cole. It's so funny." When the song ended, Cole bent deeply at the waist, like an actor taking a bow after a grand performance, and said, "Thank you all for witnessing history," which sent the whole gathering into another roar of laughter. Ruby stood beside the drinks table laughing until tears ran down her cheeks, and in that moment, she realized something strange. When the man who was as tightly sealed as a locked mailbox truly laughed, he looked like such a gentle young man that it was almost impossible to believe. The party ended late. People slowly cleaned up and made their way home, but Ruby stayed behind to help stack the chairs. When the work was finished, she saw Cole sitting on the bed of Mr. Hooper's old truck parked beside the lot, a can of soda in his hand, and his eyes lifted toward the sky. She climbed up and sat beside him. For a while, the two of them remained silent, listening to the nighttime sounds of the neighborhood, the barking of a dog far away, the sound of someone washing dishes behind a brightly lit window. "That was wonderful," Ruby said. "I haven't laughed that much in a very long time." Cole nodded. "This is a good neighborhood." Then he added, almost as though speaking to himself. The place where I lived before didn't have things like this. Ruby turned to look at him. No barbecues? Nothing like this at all, he replied. People there sat at the same table, but no one ever truly shared a meal. Ruby didn't fully understand what he meant, but she could hear the loneliness beneath his words. She was quiet for a moment, then spoke as naturally as though she were stating something obvious. Then it's a good thing you're here now. And since you're here, you aren't alone anymore. You have friends. Cole turned and looked at her. He said nothing for a very long time, so long that Ruby began to think she had said something wrong. And when he finally spoke, his voice was so soft that it almost disappeared into the sounds of the night. It's been a very long time since someone said that to me without wanting anything from me. Ruby laughed. Who said I don't want anything? If my scooter breaks down again tomorrow, I'm bringing it straight back and holding you responsible. Cole laughed too, but his eyes remained on her face for 1 second longer, the gaze of a man who had just found the answer to a very old question. The days that followed passed peacefully, but some things happened so quietly that no one noticed them. At the beginning of the month, Earl made his usual trip to the pharmacy with the help of his cane. He had already prepared himself to go without one of his medicines, because Ruby had received fewer delivery orders that month, but the pharmacist smiled and told him, "Mr. Lawson, someone has already paid for your medicine this month. The repair shop at the end of the street enrolled you in its customer appreciation program. Longtime customers receive medical assistance vouchers, so please accept them." Earl stood there in confusion. His family didn't even own a car that could have been repaired there for years, and his daughter's scooter had only been fixed once. But the pharmacist insisted that all the paperwork was in order and placed the bag of medicine into his hands. Earl carried it home, and when he passed the garage, he saw Cole bent over someone's water pump. He almost stopped to ask about it, but instead he stood watching for a while, and the older man, seasoned by a lifetime of hardship, suddenly understood something that made his eyes sting. He didn't ask any questions. He only slowed his steps as he passed the open garage and called inside. "When you have some free time, come by the house and have a cup of tea with me, son." Cole looked up and answered, "Yes, sir," then lowered his head and returned to the water pump. No one in the Lawson household knew about it, not even Ruby, because Earl kept it to himself the way people protect a gift so great that they don't yet know how to express their gratitude. And no one knew about something else either, something that happened late at night inside the garage at the end of the street. That night, after Millbrook had fallen deeply asleep, Cole sat alone at the wooden table beneath the dim glow of a yellow lamp. He opened the faded canvas bag and took out an old photograph. In it, he stood many years younger beside a silver-haired man with stern eyes, and both of them were dressed in clothes that seemed to belong to an entirely different world from this grease-stained garage. Cole studied the photograph for a long time, then removed a stack of papers from the bag, set fire to one corner over a metal barrel, and silently watched the flames consume each line of writing until nothing remained but ashes. Millbrook's peace was shattered on a Tuesday morning, at the hour when the neighborhood was at its emptiest. The children had long since gone into their classrooms. The adults who worked far away had already left, and only the owners of the small shops and a few elderly residents sitting on their porches remained along the street. A battered car painted a dull, solid black pulled to an abrupt stop in the middle of the road, and two men stepped out. One was broad and thick-set, with a gold chain around his neck as heavy as an iron link, while the other was painfully thin, his restless eyes darting about like those of a rat. They bought nothing and asked no directions. They walked straight into Mr. Hooper's grocery store, where the larger man planted one hand on the counter and spoke in a slow, oily voice. "Listen, shopkeeper. This neighborhood has become complicated lately. Theft, vandalism, all kinds of trouble. We provide protection. You pay us a small amount every month, and we make sure your business remains safe." Mr. Hooper was an honest man, and he answered that nothing had been stolen in this neighborhood for decades. The thin man gave a cold laugh. "That's right. Nothing has been stolen yet. But who knows what might disappear tomorrow? Life is hard to predict, old man." It wasn't a sales offer. It was a threat, and Mr. Hooper understood it. His hand trembled against the counter. The two men went from one business to the next. The vegetable stall, the butcher shop, the barber shop, repeating the same worn routine everywhere they went. Protection fee, paid monthly, think carefully. When they reached Mrs. Pearl's laundromat, however, they ran into the most stubborn wall in the entire neighborhood. Mrs. Pearl stood in the doorway with her hands planted firmly on her hips and spoke directly into their faces. "I've washed other people's clothes for decades and raised 3 children into decent adults. I don't have money for this nonsense. Go somewhere else." The larger man stared at her for a moment, then said nothing at all. He merely swept 1 foot sideways, knocking over the pot of red geraniums Mrs. Pearl had tended so lovingly for years outside the entrance. It crashed onto the sidewalk and shattered, scattering soil and crimson petals everywhere. The whole street fell silent. Mrs. Pearl stood frozen, staring at the broken flower pot with her lips pressed tightly together. The large man brushed off his hands and spoke as casually as though nothing had happened. "Such beautiful flowers, and now they're broken. What a shame. Think it over, ma'am. We'll be back next week." Then the 2 men climbed into their car and drove away, leaving an entire neighborhood shaken behind them. That afternoon, the shopkeepers gathered inside the laundromat to discuss what to do, every face as heavy as lead. Mr. Hooper sighed and said perhaps they should simply pay to keep the peace. Each household could contribute a little, and they could consider it money sacrificed to protect their lives. The vegetable seller wiped tears from her eyes. Where would the money come from? How much profit could someone make selling a few baskets of vegetables, only to hand part of it over to those men every month? One person argued one way, another calculated something else. Someone suggested calling the police, but another shook his head. What could they report? The men hadn't actually done anything. What police officer would come over 1 broken flower pot? And if they reported them, and those men sought revenge, they would all suffer. In the end, the neighborhood gradually leaned toward the idea of gritting their teeth and gathering the money. Throughout the entire discussion, Cole stood leaning against the doorway of his garage and listened from beginning to end without offering a single word. Ruby stopped by and asked anxiously what he thought, whether they should pay. Cole only said, "Don't collect the money yet. Wait a few days and see." Wait for what? Ruby hadn't even finished asking when he turned and walked back into the garage. But late that night, after the street had gone quiet, one person was still awake, and that person witnessed something strange. Cole walked to the corner where the streetlight couldn't reach, took out his phone, and dialed a number. The call was unusually brief, lasting about 15 seconds, and the young man from the neighboring house who happened to pass by at that moment caught only a few scattered phrases, without any clear beginning or end. They sounded like the slang of traders or passwords children might use while playing war. Something about sweeping the southern yard, something about telling Uncle Tu that they were Cole's neighbors. Cole ended the call, slipped the phone into his pocket, and returned to the garage as though nothing had happened. The young man scratched his head, decided he must have heard incorrectly, and thought no more about it. The next morning, something no one could have expected took place. The same black car from the day before appeared at the entrance to the street. The entire neighborhood held its breath, and the shopkeepers hurriedly signaled to one another, believing the men had returned earlier than promised to collect their money. But when the 2 men stepped out, everyone along the street rubbed their eyes in disbelief. The large man who had been so aggressive the day before now looked as pale as a sheet of paper and moved with timid restraint, while the thin man kept his head bowed and carried a brand new pot of geraniums in both hands, the store label still attached. They went straight to the laundromat and placed the flowers in the exact spot where the old pot had stood. Then the large man lowered his head before Mrs. Pearl and spoke in a tiny voice like a schoolboy caught misbehaving. "Ma'am, what we did yesterday was wrong. We came to apologize. Please forgive us." Mrs. Pearl's mouth fell open, and before she had time to respond, the 2 men had already moved on to Mr. Hooper's shop. There they bowed again and apologized again, then continued from one business to the next, apologizing everywhere they went, every sentence filled with respectful yes ma'ams and yes sirs. When they were finished, they climbed back into the car, and before closing the door, the large man called out one last sentence that no one understood. "From now on, we won't dare come anywhere near this neighborhood again. If anyone asks, please tell them we came and made a proper apology." The car sped away as though fleeing for its life, and from that day forward, it vanished from Millbrook forever. The whole neighborhood stood bewildered, as though they had just watched a play with its middle act torn away. People gathered in groups and talked about it for days. Mr. Hooper guessed that the police must have caught up with them. The vegetable seller wondered whether they had been struck by divine punishment or frightened by some terrible omen. Mrs. Pearl merely watered the new geraniums and narrowed her eyes toward the far end of the street, where the steady sound of a power drill continued to echo from the old garage. She said nothing, but the mind of Millbrook's radio station was turning very quickly. Ruby alone remembered Cole's words about waiting a few days. That afternoon, she walked into the garage, planted both hands on her hips, and watched him polish a wrench. "You did something, didn't you? Those two men, you did something to them." Cole didn't look up. His hand continued moving steadily over the metal. "I'm a mechanic. What could I possibly do to them?" Ruby refused to let it go. "I don't believe you. You told us to wait a few days, and a few days later, they came back practically begging the whole neighborhood for forgiveness. That can't be a coincidence." Cole set the wrench down, raised his eyes to hers, and answered with exactly 4 words. Then he lowered his head toward his tools again as though the matter were finished. "I know some people." Ruby remained there for another moment, understanding that no matter how many more questions she asked, she would receive nothing beyond that. So she finally shook her head and went home. She didn't know, and even Cole himself couldn't have imagined at the time, that the 15-second telephone call he had made in the darkness to protect this small neighborhood was like a pebble thrown into the surface of a still lake, and its ripples were already spreading very far, all the way to a high-rise building in Chicago, where certain eyes had been waiting a very long time for exactly such a signal to trace him. Millbrook had barely begun to forget the 2 men who had tried to collect protection money when another event descended upon the neighborhood, and this time, the entire street wasn't shaken by fear, but dazzled nearly blind. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, when the neighborhood was dozing beneath the pale sunlight, and a strange sound rose from the far end of the road, the low, smooth rumble of an engine, like a great cat purring, a sound no one in Millbrook had ever heard before. A gleaming silver Porsche glided into the neighborhood, moving slowly, as though even the car itself knew it was being admired. Children playing on the front steps jumped to their feet and ran after it. Adults leaned out through shop doors, and when the car stopped directly in front of the diner in the middle of the street, nearly all of Millbrook held its breath, waiting to see who would step out. The man who emerged appeared to be in his early 30s. He wore a fitted, custom-tailored gray suit. His hair was slicked back with a glossy sheen. Gold-framed sunglasses covered his eyes, and a broad gold watch on his wrist caught the sunlight so brightly that it almost hurt to look at. He removed his glasses, surveyed the street with the smile of a man returning to a place he had once known, then called out in a booming voice to everyone staring at him, "Hello, everyone. I'm Brett Vaughn. Don't look at me as though I'm a stranger. Coming here feels like coming home." That afternoon, inside the diner, crowded with curious residents, Brett Vaughn told his story in the confident voice of a man accustomed to standing before an audience. He said he was an investment fund manager on Wall Street in New York, specializing in deals worth tens of millions of dollars. He explained that his grandmother had once lived in this area, so he had always considered Millbrook part of his childhood memories, and now that he had become successful, he had returned for 2 reasons. The first was to study several properties he might purchase and develop, helping the local people transform their lives. The second, he paused and smiled with the polished charm of a man in a movie, was to find a worthy woman. "To be honest with all of you, I don't lack money. The only thing I lack is someone who understands my value." The sentence fell into the diner like a spark landing in dry straw. The women immediately began shifting in their seats, and every mother with a daughter old enough to marry unconsciously straightened her back. In one corner of the diner stood a young woman whose heart began pounding like festival drums the moment she heard those words, Crystal Lawson. She was still holding a glass of soda, her eyes fixed on the man in the gray suit without blinking, and inside her mind, every dream she had nurtured for years, the penthouse, the luxury cars, the elegant parties of the wealthy, suddenly took on flesh and blood and sat right there, exactly 3 steps away from her. Brett seemed to notice the most ardent gaze in the room as well. He walked toward her and offered a gold-plated business card embossed with the name of an investment fund that sounded tremendously impressive. "And you? The beauty of Millbrook. What is your name?" Crystal barely slept that night. She searched online for the investment fund named on the card and found an entire professional website, complete with photographs of elegant offices, growth charts, and smooth, polished English descriptions. With that, even the smallest trace of doubt vanished. A few days later, Brett personally drove her into the city center and took her to an office on a high floor with its own receptionist, leather sofas, and a sweeping view over the entire city. He told her it was the branch he had recently rented, so he could work conveniently while staying in the area. Crystal sank into the softness of that sofa. looked down at the city beneath her feet, and believed with all her heart that fate had finally come knocking at her door. She couldn't have known that the luxurious office was rented by the hour, and that the company sign outside the door had only been printed the day before. From that moment on, Millbrook found itself watching a performance even more entertaining than the mystery of the black car, a performance called Crystal Changes Her Life. The young woman everyone in the neighborhood knew had never once risen before 9 o'clock. The same young woman who had once declared that mornings were the enemy of beauty was now making noise in the kitchen at exactly 6 o'clock. Mrs. Ma from next door came over to borrow a flour sifter and found Crystal standing at the stove frying eggs. She was so startled that she stepped back outside to check the house number, convinced she had entered the wrong home. Crystal cooked, arranged the food carefully inside beautiful containers, then dressed in her finest clothes and carried it all the way to the hotel where Brett was staying. One day it was egg sandwiches, the next it was chicken soup. She would say, "I just happened to make some extra," while her hands trembled as she waited for a compliment. Brett was generous with compliments. "You're truly a treasure Millbrook has hidden well," he told her, and those words were enough to keep Crystal floating through the entire day. Ruby watched her sister change and didn't know whether she should feel happy or worried. Earl remained seated on the porch, quietly observing everything without saying a word, though the crease between his eyebrows seemed to deepen with each passing day. Meanwhile, the neighborhood chorus was working at full strength. Outside Mrs. Pearl's laundromat, the women sat shelling beans and talking excitedly. "Did you see Crystal this morning? She was marching down the street carrying 2 enormous bags of food. What an astonishing transformation." Another woman laughed until she nearly lost her breath. "Yesterday, I saw her carrying water and washing that man's car." Are we talking about the same girl who groans at home whenever her father asks her to pour him a glass of water? Mrs. Pearl continued folding clothes and delivered the final remark that nearly sent the entire group tumbling from their chairs with laughter. "I'm telling you, if one more rich man comes into this neighborhood, that girl will probably throw a refrigerator over her shoulder and run with it." Their laughter spread through the little street, and everyone treated the whole affair as a harmless amusement that made life less dull. Only one person didn't laugh. That afternoon, when the silver Porsche glided past the repair shop, Cole was standing outside wiping his hands. He watched the car disappear down the street, not with the admiration shown by everyone else in Millbrook, and not with curiosity, but with the long, motionless gaze of a mechanic listening to an engine and realizing that somewhere inside it, something wasn't making the sound it should. Over the weeks that followed, Brett Vaughn wove a net of honeyed words around Crystal, and he did it so skillfully that the prey herself became the most eager one to climb inside. Every afternoon, he drove her around in the silver Porsche, circling through the wealthy suburbs, pointing toward mansions with iron gates and lush green lawns, saying that houses like these in Manhattan would barely qualify as weekend retreats. Then he would turn toward her and lower his voice to precisely the right, warm, intimate tone. "You know, every time I see you carrying things on foot through that neighborhood, I feel sorry for you. You were born to live in Manhattan, not in a place like that." Crystal's eyes stung whenever she heard those words, because they were exactly what she had been telling herself for years, except that for the first time, a wealthy man was saying them for her. Then one evening, Brett made his most important move. Sitting in the diner, he opened a tablet and showed Crystal blinking red and green charts, explaining that his fund was about to close a major deal with a 40% return within only a few months. He said the investment opportunity was normally reserved for clients with millions of dollars, but because it was her, he had personally requested a small allocation on her behalf. He wanted his woman to have assets of her own, to be independent and proud. Crystal was still dazed by the words "his woman" when Brett waved one hand dismissively. "Just try a small amount first so you can see how it works. You have to see real money before you can believe in investing." With a mixture of excitement and nervousness, she withdrew a small portion of her savings and gave it to him. Exactly 10 days later, Brett asked her to meet him at the diner and slid a thick envelope across the table. Inside were $800 in cash. "That's your first profit," he said simply. "We're only 1/3 of the way through the deal." Crystal's hands trembled as she held the envelope. $800, nearly half a month of her receptionist's salary, had somehow flowed into her pocket after only 10 days. At that very moment, every final defense inside her collapsed. She couldn't have known that it was one of the oldest tricks used by swindlers everywhere, returning the victim's own money to the victim, sacrificing one small fish in order to capture the entire pond. From that day forward, Crystal came home as though she were walking through clouds, and dinner at the Lawson house became a stage for glorious visions of the future. She spoke about the apartment overlooking Central Park that Brett had promised to show her, about the wedding they would hold at a 5-star hotel, and about how she would eventually bring the whole family to live in the city. Earl listened to everything, then slowly placed his chopsticks on the table and began asking one question at a time. "What is the full name of his fund?" Crystal recited the impressive name printed on the business card without hesitation. He continued, "Where is the main office?" "On Wall Street in New York. I already looked it up online. The pictures are enormous and beautiful." Earl still didn't let the matter go. "What about the operating license? Have you seen any actual license?" Crystal frowned and dropped her spoon onto the table. "Oh, please, Dad. He manages tens of millions of dollars, and you're asking about a license as though he were running a street stall. You don't understand the financial world. Stop asking before people laugh at you." Earl looked at his daughter for a long time, then said only, "I may not understand the financial world, but I understand people. Anyone doing honest business isn't afraid to show their papers." Crystal sprang to her feet, carried her bowl into the kitchen, and treated the conversation as finished. Then Ruby tried. One evening, the two sisters met on the porch, and Ruby gently asked, "How far have you and Brett gone with your plans? When are you getting married?" Crystal continued filing her nails and answered without thinking, "Soon." Ruby asked, "How soon?" "Very soon. Next month, or next year?" Crystal raised her head and glared at her sister. "Important things require the right timing. What would you know about that? Go worry about your deliveries." Ruby remained patient. "Has he spoken to Dad yet? Has he chosen a day to come to our house and introduce himself properly?" Crystal threw the nail file onto the table. "You and Dad are exactly alike. He has hundreds of important things to handle. Once he finishes this major deal, he'll take care of the wedding. Don't use that delivery worker's mind of yours to measure a serious businessman." Ruby fell silent. She was used to the thorns hidden in her sister's words, but this time, it wasn't the cruelty that worried her. It was the look in Crystal's eyes, the look of someone sleepwalking in broad daylight, someone no amount of shaking could awaken. While the neighborhood was still dividing itself into two camps, those who believed Crystal was about to transform her life, and those waiting for the drama to unfold, one man had quietly reached his own conclusion long ago. One afternoon, Brett stopped at the diner in the middle of the street and stood before a crowd talking about the stock market, his hands rising and falling as the gold watch on his wrist flashed with every gesture. Cole sat at a table in the corner finishing his lunch, and his eyes passed over the man's wrist only once, a glance that lasted no more than 2 seconds. That afternoon, when Ruby stopped by the garage with several ears of boiled corn, Cole was adjusting the brakes on her scooter. When he finished, he wiped his hands and spoke one sentence without any introduction. "The watch he's wearing is fake." Ruby stared at him. "Who are you talking about?" Cole looked at her. "Your sister's Wall Street man. On a real watch of that kind, the second hand glides as smoothly as flowing water. His jerks forward one mark at a time. It's a cheap imitation. Truly wealthy people don't need to prove they're wealthy. Only hunters need to grease their traps." Before Ruby could ask another question, an icy voice came from the garage entrance. Crystal had been standing there for some time, a shopping bag in one hand and her face dark with anger. She had apparently been passing by and heard every word. She walked inside, looked Cole over from head to toe in exactly the same way she had on the first day they met outside the laundromat, then curled her lips and drew out every word. "Well, look at that. A mechanic who knows how to tell a real watch from a fake one. The most expensive thing you've ever touched in your life is probably a wrench, and you dare claim his watch is counterfeit. Let me tell you something. A man like Brett could take that watch off, sell it, and buy 10 miserable garages like this one. As for you," she added with a mocking laugh, "learn to tell real motor oil from fake oil before you start talking about the world people like us live in." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Ruby standing there in mortification, not knowing where to hide her face. Cole said nothing more. He only watched Crystal disappear into the distance and released a soft breath, the sigh of a man who could already see a car hurtling downhill, while the person behind the wheel stubbornly refused to touch the brakes. That $800 in profit was like the first drop of honey placed in a fish's mouth, and only a few days later, Brett began pulling on the line. He asked Crystal to meet him at an elegant cafe downtown, wearing an expression of regret as he explained that the major deal was about to close, that the door would shut at the end of the week, and that after that moment, even someone with billions wouldn't be able to buy a place in it. He had held her spot for as long as he possibly could, he said. "Put in everything you have left this time," Brett told her, reaching across the table and taking her hand. 40%, do you understand? When the money comes back, you can throw it in the face of everyone who ever looked down on you. That final sentence struck the darkest place inside Crystal's heart more powerfully than any number ever could. That very afternoon, she went to the bank, stood at the counter, and withdrew every dollar she had saved through years of working, every cent she had kept for her own future, without once placing anything in the family's shared tin box. She handed the entire thick envelope of cash to Brett, and in return, he gave her an ornately printed document called an investment certificate, covered with an elaborate signature and a bright red seal. Crystal placed the paper inside a drawer, as though she were putting away the ticket that would transform her life. But that night, as she lay in bed restlessly calculating the numbers, a dark thought slipped into her mind like a snake crawling through a crack beneath the door. Her money still wasn't enough to meet the minimum amount Brett had mentioned. She was still short. And inside this house, she knew exactly where more money was being kept. The old tin box in the kitchen cabinet, where Ruby and her father placed every dollar they could save for his monthly medicine and for unexpected illness or emergencies. Crystal lay listening to the breathing of everyone in the sleeping house and told herself she was only borrowing it. In a few months, when the profits arrived, she would repay twice as much, perhaps 3 times as much. The whole family would have to thank her then. And so, one quiet afternoon, while her father slept and Ruby was out making deliveries, Crystal opened the kitchen cabinet, lifted out the tin box, and took every dollar inside, leaving only a few loose coins scattered across the bottom. The truth came out on Friday night. Ruby returned from work and went to the kitchen cabinet to take the money she needed to buy her father's monthly medicine the following day. When she opened the lid of the tin box, she froze. It was almost completely empty. She turned it over, searched the cabinet around it, then slowly understood, because only 3 people lived in that house. Her father would never touch the money without asking, and she hadn't taken it. Ruby carried the tin box straight into the living room, where Crystal lay scrolling through her phone, and her voice trembled. "Crystal, where is Dad's medicine money?" Crystal glanced at the box, guilt flashing briefly across her face, before she immediately lifted her chin. "I borrowed it. I'll pay back 3 times as much in a few months." Ruby couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Borrowed it? You took Dad's medicine money and gave it to that man. And you call that borrowing?" Crystal sat up sharply. "Watch how you speak. It's an investment. Do you understand? An investment. Something that mind of yours, the one that spends all day delivering packages in the rain, will never be able to understand." Ruby placed the tin box on the table, struggling to keep her voice calm even as tears filled her eyes. "Wake up, Crystal. That fund, that office, that certificate, none of it has been verified. You're being deceived. Can't you see that? You're being deceived." Those words were like gasoline poured onto a fire. Crystal sprang to her feet, pointed directly at her sister's face, and screamed, "Shut up! What do you know? You're jealous of me." "Yes, jealous. Because I'm about to have everything and you have nothing. All you'll ever deserve is to spend your life making deliveries. That's what you deserve. I was born to be a queen. Do you hear me?" The room fell completely silent. Ruby stood there with her hands hanging at her sides, her sister's words cutting into her like knives. But what hurt most wasn't the insult. It was the realization that her own sister had drifted so far away that no one could reach her anymore. The bedroom door moved softly. Earl had been standing there for some time. He had heard everything. He didn't scold either of them. He only looked at Crystal with the tired eyes of an aging father, then turned and walked back to his room with the help of his cane, and the curve of his bent back said more than any accusation ever could. But fate hadn't finished with the Lawson family that night. Sometime after midnight, Ruby woke with a start at the sound of a quiet groan coming from her father's room. Earl's injured leg had begun hurting badly just as the weather changed, but the pain medicine in the house had run out 2 days earlier, and the new supply hadn't been purchased because the tin box was empty. Ruby frantically searched every pocket of every coat and pair of pants, gathering every last coin left from her delivery wages, then pulled on her jacket and rushed into the darkness. She pounded on the door of the all-night pharmacy in the next neighborhood and bought a strip of medicine with the final dollars she had. By the time she returned home, her hair was soaked with the cold mist of the night. She sat beside her father's bed and massaged his leg until the medicine took effect and he drifted to sleep. Then she remained there in the darkness, no longer able even to cry. And throughout that same long night, the light at the repair shop at the end of the street remained on. Cole had been standing in the doorway for a long time. He had seen the Lawson house light up in the middle of the night. He had watched Ruby rush through the mist and return with a bag of medicine in her hand. He stood there for a long while, his jaw clenched tightly, and for the first time since arriving in Millbrook, a cold, steel-like light rose in his usually calm eyes. He went back inside the garage, took out his phone, and sent a brief message. Near 1 o'clock in the morning, the black car with tinted windows once again glided into the sleeping street and stopped outside the garage. A man named Shane stepped out, entered the shop, and found Cole sitting at the wooden table with a folded piece of paper in front of him. Cole pushed it across the table. Only one name was written on it: Brett Vaughn. "Find out who he really is," Cole said. "Everything. His real name, his past, every place he has been, every person he has met." Shane picked up the paper and hesitated. "Sir, the old man's condition was that you weren't to use any resources for 1 year. If the other side finds out you broke the agreement." Cole raised his eyes and spoke only one sentence, slowly and clearly, each word distinct. "This isn't for me." Shane studied the man before him for 1 second, then nodded, folded the paper, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, and returned to the car. The black vehicle dissolved into the darkness, carrying a single name with it, and no one sleeping in that neighborhood knew that from that moment onward, the days remaining for the Wall Street investor's glamorous mask had begun counting down. That Sunday was Mrs. Pearl's 65th birthday, and according to Millbrook tradition, the birthday of the neighborhood radio station was naturally an event for the entire community. By afternoon, strings of lights had been hung across the yard behind the laundromat. Long tables had been set out. Every household had brought a dish, and Mrs. Pearl stood welcoming guests in the finest floral dress in her closet, her face glowing with a radiant smile. The children had filled themselves with cakes and candy early in the day, and when darkness fell, following the same custom as every year, the mothers herded all the little ones into Mrs. Pearl's living room, turned on a long animated movie for them, and closed the door so they could laugh inside with a world of their own, while outside in the yard, only the adults remained with coffee, pastries, and grown-up conversations. Crystal arrived at the party with Brett beside her, and she had prepared for the evening as carefully as though it were a formal introduction. She had baked a plate of butter cookies with her own hands, a batch she had ruined 3 times before finally getting right, simply because Brett had once casually remarked that butter cookies reminded him of his childhood. Throughout the party, she carried the plate beside him as though she were carrying a treasure, her face lighting up whenever anyone looked at the two of them. Brett, meanwhile, fueled by wine and the admiring eyes of the crowd, was performing at the very height of his powers as an actor. He stood in the middle of the yard with a glass of wine in his hand, speaking endlessly about the deal of a lifetime he was about to close. $50 million, ladies and gentlemen, he said, stressing every word. 50 million. I'm telling you honestly, when this deal is finished, I'll come back and invest in this entire neighborhood. I'll repair the road, expand the market, and Millbrook will begin a new chapter. The crowd murmured in admiration. Someone began to clap, and Crystal stood beside him with her head held high as though she herself had made those promises. At that exact moment, the yard gate swung open, and a gray-haired woman carrying a suitcase walked in with both arms spread wide, calling loudly as she came. "Pearl, it's me." The bus was 3 hours late. I almost missed my little sister's birthday. It was Mrs. Dorothy, Mrs. Pearl's cousin from Ohio, who traveled a long distance every year to celebrate her birthday. "Mrs." Pearl cried out with delight and hurried forward to welcome her, pulling her cousin into the middle of the yard and introducing her to everyone. "Mrs." Dorothy smiled warmly and shook hands one by one, until her eyes moved toward the man in the gray suit standing in the center of the gathering. She froze. The hand she had been extending stopped in midair. She narrowed her eyes, tilted her head, and studied Brett from his slicked hair down to his polished shoes. Her expression changed from uncertainty to astonishment. Then from astonishment, she burst into laughter so loud that the entire yard jumped. "An investor? Who?" This man? The whole party fell silent. Brett's face lost its color for a moment, but he recovered quickly and smiled. Ma'am, I believe you've mistaken me for someone else. Mrs. Dorothy stepped forward twice and planted her hands on her hips. Mistaken you? You think I could mistake this face? 3 years ago, in Marion, Ohio, a man rented a room and claimed he was a plastic surgeon from Los Angeles who had returned to open a clinic. He dressed just as elegantly as you do now. Promised to marry Susan, my younger sister's daughter. Persuaded her to hand over every dollar she had saved to invest in the clinic, then vanished one night without a trace, leaving that poor girl crying over a worthless investment paper covered in meaningless drawings. She turned toward the entire yard, her voice rising sharply. This is the man. I swear on my mother's grave. This is exactly the man. The only thing he has changed is the profession coming out of his mouth. Whispers rose like a hive of bees breaking open. Brett lifted both hands and forced an awkward laugh. Don't listen to her. I've never set foot in Ohio. I'm an investment fund manager. You all know me. But once the first piece of a row of dominoes falls, nothing can stop the second. From the corner of the yard, Tom, a taxi driver from the neighboring town and a regular customer at the laundromat, slowly placed his drink on the table and stood. His voice was hesitant but clear. I've been keeping something to myself for a while, but now I think I should say it. Last week, this man hired me to drive him to the airport to meet a business partner. On the way, he asked me to open the trunk of the Porsche and get his briefcase. I saw some papers inside and glanced at them out of curiosity. They were rental documents. That Porsche was rented by the week in the city, and the rental price was printed right there. I assumed a rich man might rent a car for amusement, so I didn't say anything. But after hearing this woman's story, I have to speak. The party exploded. People rose from their seats, and questions flew at Brett from every direction. What about the downtown office? What about the $50 million fund? Is that gold watch real or fake? The circle of people unconsciously tightened, pressing the man in the gray suit into the center of the yard beneath the pale yellow glow of the string lights. Brett turned one way, then the other, trying to defend himself. You've all lost your minds. This is slander. I'll sue every one of you. But his voice had climbed into a shrill pitch. Sweat poured from both temples, running in drops down the collar of his white shirt, and the hand holding his wineglass trembled so badly that wine spilled over the rim. Crystal stood right there in the middle of the circle, unable to say a single word. The plate of butter cookies she had baked for him was still resting in both her hands, and she remained like that, holding the plate in the middle of the earthquake, watching the man she believed was the love of her life fall apart piece by piece before the eyes of the entire neighborhood. Crystal Lawson's dream of becoming a queen had officially ended, and it had ended in the cruelest way possible. Not inside some magnificent palace, but alone on a gray sidewalk, empty-handed, her heart shattered by betrayal beyond anything she had ever imagined. During the weeks that followed, Crystal's small bedroom became her entire world. She locked the door, drew the curtains, and lay facing the wall from morning until night. Many of the meals Ruby carried upstairs and left outside her door remained untouched. She was afraid to step onto the street, afraid of the looks, afraid of the whispers behind her back, because she remembered clearly everything she had once declared in the middle of that neighborhood, every person she had looked down upon, and every poor soul she had laughed at. Now she had become the greatest subject of gossip Millbrook had ever known. In her mind, the entire neighborhood must have been delighted by her downfall. That arrogant girl got what she deserved. Perhaps now she would stop dreaming of becoming a queen. But one morning, when the supplements her doctor had prescribed ran out, and she could no longer keep asking her younger sister to buy everything for her, Crystal had no choice but to wrap a scarf around her head, lower her face, and step outside. She walked close to the edge of the road, her heart pounding as she waited for the first knife to strike. When she passed the vegetable stand, the woman behind it looked up and saw her. Instead of the mocking smile Crystal had prepared herself to endure, the woman merely nodded and spoke as naturally as she did every day. Is that you, Crystal? You've lost weight lately. You need to eat more, sweetheart. When she reached the laundromat, Mrs. Pearl was hanging clothes outside. The moment she saw Crystal, she called out, If you need anything, you tell me. Do you hear? It's when trouble comes that people need one another most. There wasn't a single sarcastic word, not one contemptuous glance, only the quiet kindness of hard-working people Crystal had once dismissed as residents of a slum. She bought what she needed and walked home, and only after closing her bedroom door did she collapse into tears. She cried even harder than she had on the day at the bank, because she finally understood that what could bring a person to their knees most painfully wasn't the cruelty of strangers, but the goodness of those they had once despised. Inside that house, the entire burden now rested on Ruby's shoulders. The savings were gone, her sister was unable to work, her father couldn't go without medicine, and now, bearing the child of the very man who had ruined her family, Crystal needed proper food and care more than ever. Without saying a word, Ruby signed up for additional night delivery shifts. She worked from 5 o'clock in the morning until nearly midnight, yet still came home in time to warm porridge for her sister, rub medicated oil into her father's aching leg, wash and hang the clothes, and only then collapse into bed for a few hours before morning came again. She did all of it without a single complaint, without once mentioning the tin box, and without ever reminding anyone of what she had sacrificed. One night, Crystal woke feeling thirsty and opened her bedroom door. She saw that the kitchen light was still on. Her younger sister was sitting slumped over the table, one hand still holding a sock she hadn't managed to remove, asleep from sheer exhaustion. In front of her sat a pot of warm red bean porridge that she had prepared for Crystal. Crystal stood watching for a long time, then asked softly, her voice breaking in the silence of the night, "Ruby, why are you still helping me? After everything I said to you, why are you still being kind to me?" Ruby woke with a start, rubbed her eyes, then smiled. Her answer was so simple that it made the listener's heart ache, "Because you're still my sister." Crystal quickly turned back toward her room so Ruby wouldn't see her crying. Then one afternoon, Earl knocked on his eldest daughter's door and entered with the help of his cane, before sitting on the edge of the bed. Crystal curled around a pillow, unable to look at him. "I'm sorry," she said, the words breaking apart as they came. "I took your medicine money. I didn't listen to you. I turned this whole family into a laughingstock. Please scold me, Dad. Can you forgive me?" Earl remained silent for a while, then did something he hadn't done since his daughters were children. He reached out and gathered the trembling young woman into his arms. His rough, calloused hand patted her back gently, soothing her as he had when she was a little girl. "Listen to me, sweetheart. You're my daughter. There has never been anything here that needed forgiving." Crystal buried her face against her father's shoulder and wept like rain. All the pride, humiliation, and fear she had held inside for so long poured out with her tears. And during the days when the Lawson family struggled through that storm, one man began appearing more and more often on their front porch, no longer quietly or in secret. The first heavy rain of the season opened 3 leaks in the old roof, and the following morning, the entire neighborhood saw Cole carrying a ladder and sheets of metal to the Lawson house. He climbed onto the roof and worked beneath the hard sunlight for hours, his hammer ringing across the street. After repairing the leaks, he inspected the gutters and fixed a loose shutter hinge as well. When the time came for Earl's follow-up examination, people saw the mechanic drive the garage's old pickup truck directly to the Lawson home. He carefully helped Earl into the vehicle, drove him to the appointment and back, then supported him all the way to the porch. Mr. Hooper teased him, "You might as well become that family's son-in-law." Cole only smiled without answering, and the next day he returned as usual, sometimes carrying a can of kerosene for the heater, sometimes spending the entire evening repairing the ancient fan in Earl's room. Crystal saw all of it through the narrow opening in her bedroom curtains. She watched the man in the grease-stained shirt climb across her roof beneath the burning sun. She watched him carry each sheet of metal. She watched him help her father into the truck with the gentleness of a man caring for his own father. And inside her heart, a comparison began forming on its own. No one forced her to make it, but she couldn't stop it. One man had come to her surrounded by glittering light, promising her the entire world, then taken the last dollar her family possessed and disappeared into the night. Another had been humiliated by her in the middle of the street and driven away as though he were something unclean. He had never promised anyone anything, yet when her family's world began collapsing, he was the one who stayed, carried a ladder to their roof, and supported her father through every step. The man who pretended to be rich took everything and ran away. The man she had mocked for being poor gave everything he could and remained. That night, Crystal sat beside her window for a long time, one hand resting gently over her stomach, where a tiny life was growing a little more each day. For the first time, she didn't think about what she had lost. She thought about how this child would one day look at its mother. You won't see the mother I was yesterday, she whispered into the darkness. I promise you, I'll learn again from the beginning. I'll learn how to become a decent person, like the people I once laughed at. Just as the Lawson family was beginning to rise again after the storm, unfamiliar visitors appeared in Millbrook, and this time, they didn't arrive in a gleaming Porsche or knock on every shop door like the two men who had demanded protection money before. They came as quietly as mist. One morning, people noticed a gray car parked at the entrance to the street. Inside sat two men in black suits, motionless as statues, with the windows lowered halfway. They remained there for hours, buying nothing, speaking to no one, simply watching. At noon, one of them stepped out and walked along the street with a perfectly straight and measured stride. The kind of walk that didn't belong in a place like this. He stopped at the diner, ordered a cup of coffee, then casually began talking to the owner. I hear there's a very talented mechanic in this neighborhood. Is that right? The garage at the end of the street. Has he been here long? Does he live alone? Does he travel far very often? Is he close to any particular family around here? The questions were scattered skillfully through the conversation, sounding as natural as idle talk from a passing traveler. But even the honest and trusting diner owner felt uneasy. Who asked so many questions about a mechanic without once asking what he charged for repairs? More disturbing was what the young man from the neighboring house happened to witness that afternoon. Ruby was standing on her front porch, arranging parcels on her scooter before leaving for her evening delivery shift, when the man in the black suit, seated inside the gray car some distance away, quietly raised his phone. The young man would have sworn that the camera was pointed directly at the delivery girl. One photograph, then another, and afterward, the car slowly rolled away, as silent as though it had never existed. The young man told Mrs. Pearl what he had seen, and this time, Millbrook's radio station didn't broadcast the news to the entire neighborhood as she usually did. Mrs. Pearl's face changed as she listened. She quietly closed the laundromat early, went straight outside, and stopped Ruby as she returned from her deliveries. Pulling her behind the counter, she lowered her voice to the softest level her mouth had ever managed. Listen to me, sweetheart. Two strangers in black suits have been hanging around our neighborhood for the past 2 days. They've been asking questions about Cole everywhere, and according to Timmy, they took pictures of you this afternoon. Do you understand? I've lived a long time, and I know this much. The kind of men who ask questions without needing answers, and photograph people without even saying hello, are either police or something even more frightening than police. You need to tell Cole, and you need to be careful. Ruby felt the hand holding her helmet slowly grow cold. Why would anyone photograph her? She had nothing except an old scooter and a pile of delivery orders, unless what they wanted wasn't her, but the person she had grown close to. That night, Ruby tossed restlessly in bed as the scattered pieces from the past rose inside her mind, like fragments of wood floating to the surface of dark water. The black car parked outside the garage at midnight, the two protection men returning to bow and apologize. Brett Vaughn, reckless enough to deceive an entire neighborhood, fleeing the moment he heard the word Chicago. The shadow that passed through Cole's eyes whenever she asked where he came from. And now, men in black suits, taking photographs of her from a distance. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles from Millbrook, on the highest floor of a glass tower overlooking streams of city traffic that resembled lines of ants, a man with salt and pepper hair sat behind a black wooden desk as broad as a bed. People called him Ray Brennan. A subordinate approached timidly and placed a large envelope on the desk. Ray opened it and removed a stack of photographs, turning them over one by one with fingers covered in gold rings. A photograph of an old repair shop, a photograph of a man in a grease-stained work shirt bending over a machine, and a photograph of a delivery girl smiling. He lingered over that one the longest, then threw the entire stack onto the desk as the corner of his mouth lifted into a smile without warmth. So that's where my nephew has been hiding, and now he has a weakness. Back in Millbrook, sometime after midnight, the familiar black car with tinted windows once again glided into the neighborhood, but this time, it didn't park leisurely as it had before. Its lights went dark at the entrance to the street, and it slipped toward the garage door before Shane stepped out with the speed of a man who had no time to waste. Cole was sitting beside the wooden table, and one look at his lieutenant's face was enough to tell him something was wrong. Shane didn't waste words. "Sir, they've found us." Cole placed his cup of tea on the table. "How?" Shane swallowed hard. "The call last month, the night you ordered those two protection men dealt with, and the order to investigate Kowalski last week. Both went through our family's network, and the family isn't as clean inside as it was when the old man was still in control. Someone followed the trail. Ray's men have come to this town. They've taken photographs and created files. A file on you, and one on the Lawson girl as well. The garage went silent for 1 second. Then a thunderous crash made the desk lamp sway. Cole slammed his palm against the wooden table and sprang to his feet, his jaw clenched and his breathing heavy. In nearly a year in Millbrook, the mechanic had never raised his voice at anyone and had never lost his composure over anything. When he was humiliated in the street, he smiled. When people questioned him, he remained silent. Yet in that moment, for the first time, he lost control, because he understood something more bitter than any threat. Both times he had broken the promise he made to his father, once to save the neighborhood shops from a pair of worthless predators, and once to tear the mask from the man who had drained the Lawson family dry. He had done it to protect this place. Yet those very acts had become two spreading trails of oil, leading the sharks from Chicago all the way here, straight to the front porches of the people he most wanted to protect. Shane stood silently, waiting for his orders. A long time passed before Cole finally sat down. His voice had returned to calm, but it was the kind of calm that sent a chill through anyone who heard it. Uncle Ray can come after me if that's what he wants, but if he even thinks about touching this street— Cole paused and looked through the dark doorway toward the faint lights beneath the roofs of the sleeping homes. Then he'll learn why my father chose me instead of him. 2 days later, the thing Mrs. Pearl had feared finally came, but it arrived in a way no one had expected. That afternoon, Ruby had just completed her final delivery in the neighboring district and was wheeling her scooter out of a narrow alley when the gray car everyone had been talking about slowly approached and blocked the exit. The door opened, and a man in a black suit stepped out. He appeared to be around 50, with his hair combed back and a smooth, expressionless face. And what frightened Ruby most was how polite he sounded. "You're Miss Lawson, aren't you? Please give us 5 minutes. We mean you no harm. We only want to talk, right here, in broad daylight. You don't need to be afraid." Ruby gripped the handlebars tightly, her heart pounding, but she didn't run. She straightened her back. "Who are you, and why have you been taking pictures of me?" The man didn't answer. He opened a leather briefcase, removed a large photograph, and held it out in front of her. "Look carefully, then ask us who we are." Ruby lowered her eyes toward the photograph, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to tilt. It showed a man in a perfectly tailored black suit descending the stone steps of an imposing building. 4 or 5 other men in black suits surrounded him, all bowing their heads, one of them bending deeply at the waist. And the man at the center of the photograph, that face, those still eyes— no matter how unfamiliar he looked in clothes so elegant, Ruby recognized him immediately, because she had seen that face almost every day for nearly a year, beside a container of food, beside ears of boiled corn, beside her old delivery scooter. The man in the black suit watched her expression, before slowly speaking in the even tone of someone reading from a report. "Do you know who you've been cooking for, Miss Lawson?" The man in that photograph is Cole Brennan, head of the Brennan family. A name that makes the entire Chicago underworld bow its head. The ports, the warehouses, the streets after dark. Half that city moves with his permission. Why do you think those 2 men collecting protection money came back and knelt to apologize? Why do you think Kowalski heard the word Chicago and ran for his life? Ruby stood motionless, the photograph trembling in her vision. The man reached into the briefcase again, removed a small pale blue piece of paper, and placed it on the seat of her scooter. "This is a check for $50,000. The recipient's name has been left blank. All you need to do is write in your own name. The condition is very simple. Stay away from him. End all contact and behave as though you never met the mechanic at the end of the street. This money is enough to pay off your mother's hospital debt, treat your father's leg, and give you a much easier life. We're doing this for your own good." Standing close to Cole Brennan has never been a safe place for a delivery girl. Ruby looked at the check resting on the scooter seat. $50,000. She understood better than anyone what that amount would mean for her family. It meant tearing up the stack of bills on the kitchen table. It meant her father never running out of medicine again. It meant the end of nighttime deliveries beneath the rain. She stared at it for a long time, then picked it up, and before the eyes of the man in the black suit, whose face showed emotion for the first time, she tore it in half, placed the 2 halves together, tore them in half again, and let the pieces fall to the ground. "I don't know who you are or what you want, Ruby said, her voice trembling but every word clear. "But I don't make a habit of learning about someone through the mouths of strangers. Whoever he is, I'll ask him myself." With that, she climbed onto her scooter, started the engine, and drove away, leaving the man in the black suit watching her with the pieces of the check scattered at his feet. Ruby rode through the fading light, unable to see the road clearly, her mind filled with nothing but that photograph, and she continued straight toward the end of the street, braking sharply outside the garage just as night fell. Cole was wiping his hands beside the workbench, and when he saw her face, he stopped. Ruby walked inside, pulled from her coat pocket the photograph she had snatched from the man's hand before leaving, placed it on the wooden table beneath the yellow light, and asked in a voice she struggled to keep steady, "Who is this?" The garage fell completely silent, except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Cole looked down at the photograph. He studied it for a very long time, as though he were staring at someone he had once known who had died years ago and had now risen from the grave. Ruby waited. She waited for him to say the picture had been altered, that they had mistaken him for someone else, that there was some explanation, any explanation at all. But when Cole raised his eyes, he didn't look away, and he spoke exactly 2 words. "It's me." Those words fell between them, and the small world Ruby had known for nearly a year shattered like glass. She stepped back half a pace, her lips trembling. "Then your name? Is Cole false too?" Cole slowly shook his head. "My name is real. Cole Brennan. Everything I've done here, repairing cars, living in this garage, all of it has been real. There is only one thing I never told you, who I was before I came here, and who I'll eventually have to return to being." Tears began spilling from Ruby's eyes before she realized it. She laughed, but the sound was more painful than crying. "How wonderful. For an entire year, every meal I brought you, every ear of corn I saved for you, I thought I was helping a poor man. I felt sorry for you because you were alone in a strange place. I worried you didn't have enough to eat. And all this time, you were the crime boss of an entire city. You must have found me ridiculous, the delivery girl bringing the king a container of cold food." Cole stepped toward her, and for the first time, his voice lost its calm. "No. Listen to me. All my life, people have brought me everything. Money, gifts, kind words, but every one of them wanted something from me, or they were afraid of me. Only you fed me when you believed I had nothing. You called me your friend when you thought I was penniless. You're the only person who didn't help a poor man. You helped a human being." Ruby stood there with tears running down her face. His words were so sincere that she knew they were true, but because they were true, her heart became even more tangled, because the man standing before her was both the closest friend she had ever known and a complete stranger. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand and stepped toward the doorway. "I need time," she said, her voice hoarse. "Don't follow me." Then she turned away and wheeled her scooter home through the darkness, leaving the most powerful man in Chicago standing motionless inside the grease-stained garage, for the first time in his life not knowing what to do with himself. 2 days after that night at the garage, while Ruby was still moving through the house like someone whose spirit had left her body, and Earl had begun to sense that something was terribly wrong, Cole appeared on the Lawson family's front porch late that afternoon. He brought nothing with him except himself. Standing below the steps, he lowered his head respectfully to Earl. "Sir, I've come to tell you everything I've kept hidden. You and Ruby have the right to hear the truth. After you've heard it, whether you want me to leave or stay, I'll accept your decision." Earl studied the young man standing beneath the afternoon sunlight for a long time, then nodded and pointed toward the wooden chair on the porch. "Sit down, son. This house has never turned away anyone who came to speak the truth." Ruby sat on the doorstep without looking at him, and beneath the golden light of sunset spreading across the little street, Cole began to tell his story in the slow, even voice of a man who had rehearsed these words 1,000 times inside his mind. He told them that he had been born in Chicago into a family outsiders mentioned only in whispers, the Brennan family, and that his father, the silver-haired man in the old photograph, had ruled that underworld for 30 years. 1 year earlier, his father had died after a serious illness, and in his will, he had left his only son a condition that no one on the family council could understand. Before Cole could inherit his position, he had to leave Chicago and live for 1 full year without his identity, without money, and without using any of the family's resources, in a town called Millbrook, the place where Cole's grandfather had once been a poor laborer before leaving for the city to build a new life. the original home of the Brennan family. I want you to understand where our family came from before you decide where you will lead it." That was the final line in the letter his father had left behind. During Cole's absence, temporary control had been given to his father's younger brother, Uncle Ray. Cole paused when he reached that name, then continued, his voice growing lower. "He has waited his entire life for that chair, and now that he's sitting in it, he doesn't want to stand up again. His men traced the 2 times I broke the rules, the call that drove away the men collecting protection money, and the order to investigate the swindler Kowalski, and that's how they found me here. They photographed Ruby and offered her a check for $50,000, not because they cared about anyone, but because Uncle Ray believed that if he could separate Ruby from me, or threaten me through her, I would lose heart and abandon the trial before the year was complete, leaving the position legally and unquestionably his." When Earl heard this, the hand resting on the top of his cane tightened. Ruby finally spoke, asking the first question she had uttered throughout the entire conversation. "Then everything you did here, being kind to the neighborhood and helping my family, was that part of the condition too? Something you did to prove you were worthy?" Cole turned toward her and shook his head. Then he said what he told them mattered more than everything else he had revealed. "No. My father's condition was only that I live here for 1 year. No one ordered me to help anyone, but that year gave me the answer my father may have hoped I would discover for myself. I grew up in his world, believing that power was the only thing that made people respect you. Then I came here as a poor mechanic with nothing to my name. I was humiliated in the middle of the street, and inside that grease-stained garage, when I finished repairing someone's vehicle and they took my hand to thank me, I felt more respected than I ever did when an entire council bowed before me. I've made my decision, sir. I'll return and accept that position, not to become my father, but to do what he didn't have time to finish. I'll bring the entire organization out of the shadows and turn every part of it into legitimate business. The ports, the warehouses, the machine shops. It will take many years, and it won't be easy. But I would rather spend 10 years doing that than spend my entire life as a king in the darkness." The porch remained silent for a long time after he finished, with only the afternoon wind passing across the newly repaired metal roof. At last, Ruby stood. For the first time since the night at the garage, she looked directly into his eyes and spoke each word clearly. "Thank you for telling the truth, but I can't give you any answer now. I need time. Time to understand whether the man I knew for nearly a year and the man in that photograph are truly the same person. And you need to settle your own affairs. Your family, your uncle, all of it. Finish what you have to do. I'm asking you for only one thing. Don't let anything from that world touch my family ever again." Cole looked at her and nodded. "I promise." That very night, the black car arrived outside the garage to take Cole away. Before getting in, however, he stood beneath the streetlight speaking to Shane for a long time, and the only words anyone heard were the final ones. "You stay here. Bring 2 men with you. I'm going back to Chicago alone. Remember this clearly. Anything can happen to me, but no one touches this street." The car pulled away and dissolved into the darkness, and the following morning, for the first time in nearly a year, the metal door of the repair shop at the end of the street didn't open. The neighborhood buzzed like a broken beehive. Some said Cole had gone home on urgent business. Others guessed he had gone to collect supplies. Only Mrs. Pearl noticed something else. 3 unfamiliar workers in utility clothes had suddenly appeared to repair a water pipe at the entrance to the street. But their work was strangely slow. They dug it up and filled it in again for an entire week without finishing. They arrived at exactly the same time every morning and left at exactly the same time each afternoon. And their eyes constantly moved across the neighborhood, rarely looking down at the pipe they were supposedly repairing. Mrs. Pearl brought the mystery to the women shelling beans. "Have you ever seen water workers with hands that clean, standing around all day without a speck of mud on them? Maybe the water department has started hiring men just for decoration." The women roared with laughter, but Mrs. Pearl didn't laugh completely. She narrowed her eyes at the 3 strangers, then looked toward the silent garage door at the end of the street, and inside the mind of Millbrook's radio station, one question continued circling without ever fading. Where had that mechanic gone? When would he return? And would he ever return at all? What happened in Chicago during the days that followed was something the people of Millbrook would never witness. And perhaps that was for the best, because it belonged to a world they had no need to know. Yet many years later, throughout the underworld of that great city, People would still whisper about the night the Brennan heir returned. There were no gunshots, no fighting, nothing resembling the films people were accustomed to watching. There was only a conference room on the highest floor of a glass tower, where the entire family council sat around a long table beneath the light of a chandelier, and Ray Brennan occupied the seat at the head, the seat he had grown accustomed to holding for the past year. The door opened without a knock. Cole walked in alone, without guards or attendants, dressed in a simple black suit, and everyone in the room rose to their feet except one man. Ray remained seated and smiled. "You've returned earlier than expected. The year isn't over yet. Or did you grow tired of living in that miserable little place?" Cole didn't answer. He walked the length of the table in silence, each step slow and measured, and when he reached his uncle, he placed a thick file on the polished wood. In the room, where no one dared breathe too loudly, the sound of paper touching the table could be clearly heard. "Open it," Cole said, his voice as calm as though he were discussing the weather. Ray glanced down at the file, and the smile on his face slowly hardened with every page he turned. Accounts that had been moved through layers of overseas transfers during his temporary rule. Family assets quietly reassigned to shell companies under his personal control. Secret meetings held behind the council's back with rival families, and the payment order for the men sent to a town called Millbrook, along with the check for $50,000. Page after page, the entire year Ray Brennan had believed was carefully concealed, lay exposed across the table, gathered with such precision that even he couldn't understand how it had been done. Cole stood upright and looked at his uncle before speaking in front of the entire council, slowly and clearly. "I'm giving you two choices. First, tonight you accept a one-way ticket to Europe, spend the rest of your life in retirement, and never return. Second, you remain in that chair, and I'll pass this file to every person around this table, one page at a time. Then allow them to decide your fate according to the laws of the family. Choose." The room became as silent as the bottom of the sea. Ray Brennan looked around the long table, searching for the eyes of an ally, a nod, a hand, anything at all. But every face around him was either lowered or turned toward the young man standing before him. In that moment, he understood what his nephew had understood long ago. Power built through schemes was like a house made of paper. It might appear sealed against the wind, but once someone found the courage to strike a match, no one would remain beside it to put out the flames. Ray's shoulders collapsed. He stood, said nothing, fastened the button of his suit jacket, and walked out of the room he had spent a year believing belonged to him. People said the flight left Chicago shortly before dawn, and after that night, no one in the organization ever spoke Ray Brennan's name again, as though he had never existed. In the days that followed, Cole worked like a machine that never stopped. He summoned the council and presented the plan he had written and rewritten during those nights when he sat alone inside the Millbrook garage. Step by step, he would pull every part of the family's operations out of the darkness, legalize the ports and warehouses, establish transportation and construction companies, build a chain of machine shops, open transparent financial records, and sever every hidden arrangement. There were furrowed brows and low murmurs until one elderly council member finally spoke. "Sir, if we do this, our profits will fall to 1/3. Do you understand that?" Cole looked at him. "I do, but our children and grandchildren will be able to spend that 1/3 in daylight. They'll be able to hold their heads high and tell people what their fathers and grandfathers did for a living. My father sent me back to our roots so I could understand where this family came from. I understand now. We came from an honest, impoverished mechanic, and I'm going to lead all of us back to that road." No one raised another objection. Stack after stack of documents was signed, seal after seal was pressed into place, and the enormous machine of the Brennan family began slowly changing direction, like a great ship altering its course in the middle of the ocean. Back in Millbrook, 2 weeks passed as slowly as 2 years. The garage door remained silent. The 3 supposed water workers continued digging up and filling in their endless pipe. And every day Ruby rode past the end of the street, telling herself she wouldn't look toward that metal door, and failing every single time. Then, one Saturday afternoon, while the neighborhood rested lazily beneath the sunlight, a sound rose from the entrance to the street. It wasn't the elegant purr of the Porsche from before, but the familiar coughing engine of the old pickup truck, a sound that made Mr. Hooper leap from his chair the moment he heard it. "Everyone, Cole's back. Cole has come home." The whole neighborhood poured onto their porches. The pickup stopped outside the garage, and the man who stepped out left everyone staring. There was no black suit, no luxury car, no entourage, only their mechanic, dressed in the same faded, grease-stained work clothes he had worn before, carrying his toolbox in one hand. He unlocked the metal door and raised it high, just as he had done for nearly a year. Then he did something that made all of Millbrook hold its breath. He walked the length of the street, past the laundromat and the vegetable stand, beneath the eyes of dozens of people, until he reached the Lawson porch, where Ruby had just stepped outside after hearing the commotion. And there, before her, before Earl, before the entire neighborhood gathering around them, the most powerful man in Chicago slowly lowered himself onto one knee upon the ground of that poor street. Ruby stood frozen, both hands covering her mouth. Cole looked up at her and spoke loudly enough for her to hear, sincerely enough for the whole neighborhood to bear witness. "I went back to Chicago and settled everything with my family. No one will ever dare touch you or this street again. I've signed the papers. My father's empire is being transformed into legitimate businesses, one part at a time. It will take years, perhaps even 10 years, but I've begun, and I'll see it through to the end." He paused and drew a breath. His voice grew softer, but every word remained clear. "I know you need time before you can trust me. So today I haven't brought you a kingdom. I haven't brought a diamond ring or promises covered in gold. I've brought only one thing, a mechanic who keeps his word." The entire street held its breath as it waited for the delivery girl's answer. Ruby stood on the porch step, looking down at the man kneeling on one knee before her. Tears had already filled her eyes, but she didn't let them fall yet, because during those 2 weeks of waiting, she had made certain promises to herself. If he came back, she wouldn't say yes merely because her heart was soft. She would speak clearly, once and for all, before her father and beneath the open sky. She stepped down one stair, then another, until she stood directly in front of him. And when she spoke, her voice trembled, but not a single word faltered. "Cole, I heard everything you said, and I believe you. But before I give you my answer, you need to hear my condition. I'm not marrying an empire. I'm not marrying the Brennan family, the black cars, or the name that makes people bow their heads. I'm marrying a man, the man who ate the meals I packed, repaired my scooter, and sat with me on the bed of an old truck while I told him about my life. So if one day, whether it's 10 years from now or 20, you're forced to choose between your power and this family, then—" She didn't have time to finish. Cole interrupted her, still kneeling on the ground, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've already chosen. I chose that night when you tore up the check. They offered you $50,000 to walk away from me, enough money to change your entire life, and you tore it apart without hesitation simply to keep the right to hear the truth from my own mouth. That night I understood that even my entire empire couldn't buy someone like you. So what would be the point of keeping an empire if it meant losing you?" Ruby stood in silence, and this time the tears truly fell. She couldn't stop them. She gave one small nod. Nothing more, but the entire neighborhood saw it, and applause exploded like fireworks. Mrs. Pearl sobbed even louder than the future bride. Mr. Hooper whistled toward the sky, and the women from the vegetable stand embraced one another and jumped with joy as though their own daughter had just been proposed to. Cole rose, and Ruby threw herself into his arms amid the cheers of the poor little street. Earl had been standing on the porch with his cane for some time, his eyes red with emotion, and when Cole helped Ruby back up the steps and bowed his head before him, saying, "Sir, please give me your permission," Earl didn't let him finish. He placed his rough, calloused hand on the young man's shoulder and squeezed tightly, his voice breaking. "I've been waiting a long time to hear you ask me that, son. Ever since the day the pharmacist handed me that bag of medicine and told me about some customer appreciation program from your garage, I've hoped there would come a day when I could call you that." Cole froze. So the old man had known all along, known and remained silent, and the two men, one old and one young, stood there gripping each other's shoulders, unable to say another word. But amid that sea of happiness, one person remained motionless behind the window. Crystal had witnessed everything from inside the house, from the moment the old pickup truck returned, to the mechanic lowering himself onto one knee, to the words about an empire, Chicago, and the Brennan name. Inside her mind, time began running backward like a film played in slow reverse, returning to that morning outside the laundromat nearly a year earlier, when the young man in the grease-stained shirt had greeted her politely, and she, with all her cheap pride, had looked him over from head to toe, and said, "Come back when you have a supercar if you want to speak to me." She had spent her entire youth waiting for a wealthy and powerful man. She had handed both her heart and her money to a fraud, simply because he wore the exact image she had always dreamed of. While the real man, truly wealthy, truly powerful, powerful enough that his name made an entire city lower its head, had stood before her from the very first day, had greeted her first, and had been driven away by her as though he were a beggar. Crystal didn't break down in tears as she had before. She simply remained there for a long time, one hand resting over her stomach, and felt something inside her quietly come to an end. Her final dream of becoming a queen had finally died, not in humiliation, but in understanding. Late that afternoon, after the crowd had thinned, Cole was arranging his tools outside the garage when Crystal came to see him. She stopped several steps away, her hands clasped together, and spoke without circling around the truth. "Cole, I owe you an apology for what happened outside the laundromat. I judged you by your appearance, and I was wrong. So wrong that I paid for it with my entire life." Cole looked up at the woman standing before him. There was no trace left of the arrogant girl she had once been, and he answered gently, "That belongs to the past." Crystal shook her head. "Not for me, it doesn't. That's why I need to say everything. Thank you for exposing that man before I had the chance to lose even more, and for treating my family with more kindness than I ever showed you." Cole only smiled and held out his hand. "Then let's begin again. Hello, I'm Cole, the mechanic at the end of the street." Crystal released a sound that was half laughter and half tears, then took his calloused hand. "Hello, I'm Crystal, your future sister-in-law." And Crystal's transformation this time wasn't a performance of waking early and cooking as she had done while chasing the swindler. It was slower, quieter, and far more real. The following week, she returned to the hotel and asked for her job back, accepting a lower position with lower pay, and at the end of the month, for the first time in her life, she placed nearly her entire salary into the tin box inside the kitchen cabinet. Every afternoon after work, people saw her rolling up her sleeves to help her younger sister wash clothes and prepare meals, guiding her father out to the porch for fresh air, and whenever she passed the laundromat or the vegetable stand, the young woman who had once walked through the neighborhood with her head raised as though no one around her existed, now stopped and offered greetings to everyone, from Mrs. Pearl to the vegetable seller, asking about everything from the flower pot to someone's grandchild. At first, the neighborhood was astonished. Then it became familiar, and Mrs. Pearl, speaking with the full authority of Millbrook's radio station, gave her official approval with one final remark to the women shelling beans. "I'm telling you honestly, falling down and standing up again is something ordinary, but falling down and rising as a kinder human being, that's what you call a blessing, and the Lawson family has finally been blessed with all of it." The following spring, Millbrook welcomed the greatest event in its history, the wedding of the delivery girl and the mechanic from the end of the street. Cole had once suggested holding it at a grand hotel in the city, but Ruby shook her head. "I want to marry you here, on this very street, where you were once driven away, and where you were also loved." Hearing that, the most powerful man in Chicago could only smile and nod, because he had already learned that in his future home, the person making the most important decisions wouldn't be him. And so the broad yard beside Mrs. Pearl's laundromat, where the neighborhood barbecues had been held and where the great exposure had taken place that unforgettable night, was decorated by the entire community over 3 full days. Tables and chairs stretched from one end of the yard to the other. Strings of lights covered the space overhead. Mr. Hooper personally took charge of the grill. Every woman brought a dish for the guests, and Mrs. Pearl hurried back and forth in a new floral dress, never missing a chance to tell every unfamiliar visitor that she had been the first person to realize there was more to Cole than met the eye. The wedding was as simple as Ruby had wanted, with no red carpet and no procession of luxury cars. The bride wore a modest white dress and walked arm in arm with her father. Earl leaned on his cane that day, but his back stood straighter than usual as he guided his youngest daughter between the 2 rows of chairs beneath the applause of the entire neighborhood. Yet there was one thing the guests couldn't stop whispering about, and that was the flowers. There were more flowers than anyone had ever seen. Enormous, elegant arrangements arriving one after another from early morning until an entire corner of the yard was filled. Every card said it had been sent from Chicago and carried the name of some company so long that no one could keep count of them all. Mrs. Pearl finally declared with immense pride. "Our neighborhood wedding may be simple, but all of Chicago sent flowers. Do you understand?" The happiest guests were the children. They had been given the task of scattering petals along the bride's path, and they carried out that responsibility exactly as children would, running in every direction, throwing petals into the air, and filling the yard with laughter. One child used up every petal halfway down the aisle, then turned around, gathered the fallen ones from the ground, and scattered them again, sending the entire wedding into fits of laughter. The groom, a man once feared by the underworld of an entire city, bent down, lifted the smallest child onto his shoulders, and let the little one scatter petals from above while everyone cheered. After the wedding, their life together was so ordinary that it surprised many people. Ruby didn't move to the great city. She remained in Millbrook with her husband, and the first major thing she did with her new position was establish a fund named after her mother to help poor working families pay their medical bills, so that no child would ever have to carry a stack of hospital debts for 7 years as she once had, and no family would have to sell everything because of a devastating illness. Cole, although occupied with transforming an enormous system into legitimate companies, refused to give up the repair shop at the end of the street. On weekends, people could still see the chairman of those great businesses wearing the same familiar grease-stained work clothes, lying beneath a neighbor's vehicle, changing the oil and tightening bolts, accepting payment only in the form of a packed meal or a few ears of boiled corn, just as he had before. Life had one final surprise in store for Crystal. One morning, she received a thick envelope with no sender's name. When she opened it, she found money inside. Her hands trembled as she counted, and she was stunned to realize that it was the exact amount, down to the final dollar, of everything she had lost, both her savings and the money meant for her father's medicine. A brief typed note had been included. Brett Vaughn, whose real name was Danny Kowalski, sends his apologies. He will spend the next several years apologizing to everyone else, one by one, from a place with iron bars. Only much later did Crystal learn that Cole had quietly turned the entire file on the man over to the police, every location, every victim, and every piece of evidence. The professional swindler who had brought misery to so many women across numerous states was finally brought before a court and made to answer for everything under the law, not by anyone's fists, but through justice delivered openly in the light of day. Holding that note, Crystal cried, but they were the first tears of relief she had shed after so many storm-filled days. Then summer arrived, and Crystal gave birth to a healthy baby girl. The cry of the newborn rang through the Lawson family's small house like the bell of a new beginning. On the first night, she held her daughter in her arms and looked down at the tiny sleeping face. Crystal bent to kiss her forehead and whispered the promise she had carried through the longest months of her life. "I promise you, I'll live differently. You'll grow up and see that your mother is a decent person." And she kept her word. As the years passed, people watched Crystal work hard, raise her daughter well, live warmly among her neighbors, and become a devoted aunt to the children who came later. The story of the Lawson sisters continued to be told by the people of Millbrook to their children and grandchildren, like a lesson that never grows old. Because that story reminds us that wealth can be false, titles can be false, outward splendor can be false, and a gold watch can be false. But the kindness a person gives when they have nothing in their hands is the truest treasure of all, something no amount of money can buy. Never judge a person by the clothes they wear, because sometimes beneath a magnificent suit lies an empty heart, while beneath a shirt stained with grease lies a heart made of gold. Happiness truly knocks only on the doors of those who learn to see people with their hearts instead of merely with their eyes. Dear friends, the story of the delivery girl and the mysterious mechanic of Millbrook has now come to an end. We don't know how you feel about this story, about Ruby's choice, or about the lesson Crystal learned, so please share your thoughts in the comments below. We sincerely hope to hear the feelings that come from the deepest part of your hearts. If you found this story meaningful, please don't forget to press like, share the video with your family and friends, and subscribe to our channel so that every day you can hear more new, moving, and captivating stories. We wish you and your family abundant health, a joyful life, and peace and serenity in every passing day. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.